Hello, I'm George Liston, CA, and this is Dialogue, a weekly exploration into the worlds of international affairs, history, and culture. For close observers of the transatlantic relationship, these are intriguing times. The estrangement between the United States and some of its European partners has grown so acute that one could easily resort to this old tabloid cliché. Can this marriage be saved? Although differences over the Iraq War may be at the epicenter of the dispute, there's a broad range of issues, current and potential, that serve to challenge the future of what has been a long, proud, and successful alliance. My guests today are Constanze Stelzenmüller, Defense and Security Editor of the German weekly Die Zeit, John Holzman, Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and Samuel Wells, Director of the West European Studies Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Constanze, John, and Sam, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. My goodness, we have a lot to talk about. Maybe I'll start with the most talked about four-letter word in the world today, and that's Iraq. Constanze, you have called this moment, this sort of transatlantic moment, a defining moment. And I think the further phrase you use, which I'm actually going to quote, it's so eloquent, in which our institutions, our alliances, and our notion of our place in the world, as Europeans and Americans, is in flux. Iraq must be at the bullseye of this flux. What do Europeans on the one hand and Americans on the other fail to understand about each other in that debate, in this debate?
How much time do we have? I think the mistakes the Americans have made here is in overestimating the uses of the military instrument, crassly. They've also made a mistake in the way they've dealt with their allies and even with the people they wish to befriend. Conversely, the mistake that the Europeans have made is in really not understanding the uses of the military instrument. And I think underestimating also very much the dangerousness of Saddam Hussein and keeping him in power.
Is this in the essence of what you've just said, contention over our use of power in the world, the way we understand it versus the way
Very
Europeans
much so.
traditionally may think of it?
Very much so. We've been essentially talking past each other.
Past each other on this level, and probably other levels as well, I think. John, Sam, comments on this?
Well, I think we have misunderstood what was facing us in Iraq. I think we misunderstood the nature of the country. We misunderstood the extent to which, obviously, we would be welcomed. And we really misunderstood the extent to which a group of Iraqi exiles would be welcomed back into their own country and had the potential to assume leadership posts.
Did we misunderstand also the need to pursue aggressively? I mean, some say we really cut off, well, many say we cut off the UN process and sort of didn't give that whole procedure a chance to work. And that was a major stumbling block between us and the European view.
It was certainly a stumbling block with the Europeans. I'm not sure it would have terribly changed things in the country. Saddam would have just stretched it out longer. Conditions would have continued to deteriorate in the country. Sooner or later, something had to be done. I don't think many European governments would have changed their minds and gone with us after another 6 or 8 months. So in a sense, if it had to be done, probably March was as good a time as any to do it. February, according to our administration, would have been even better. But no, I think the timing would not have, a delay in the operation to pursue further sanctions would not have improved
much at all.
The coalition we took with us.
Right.
I think something that Constanze said really has to be stressed. Europeans, because they don't have a power instrument and a military power, don't talk much about it. It's a good debating trick. You don't highlight the fact that you don't have one of the major tools of power, and they underplay it. Americans, because it's the one area of the world where they really are preeminent. All the other areas you look at, soft power, economics, diplomacy, politics, certainly the intelligence sharing, they're not. And in fact, you go through the laundry list of how to deal with al-Qaeda, and you'll find that in none of those areas is the United States capable of acting alone. And so what has happened is a group of people within the administration have taken the one attribute of all of them in power and made it the overarching attribute of everything. And I think that's the way we talk past each other. And a point kind of Sam was making that is fundamental. Nobody read Clausewitz. We all forgot politics drives military situations. Again, because the military people, particularly in the DOD, are preeminent within the bureaucratic politics of this town, or were. They didn't want to hear that. But the problem is that we could have the best military strategy for dealing with now ongoing, and if we don't solve the fundamental political problem of what Iraq is and what it might be with the Iraqis, that's the legitimacy question.
Right.
With the Iraqis, no amount of defense strategy is going to matter. It's not having a political strategy going in that is the fundamental error in all this. And now the strategy has changed 3 or 4 times in the last 6 months. That doesn't really show confidence. Whatever they decide to do now, let's take a little bit of time and then stick to it. But we must involve the Iraqis and make them stakeholders, because otherwise this thing's going to go very, very wrong indeed.
Let me pick up on John's point and turn to you, Constanza, because I think John has just emphasized the fact that this American dependence on a military solution to the possible exclusion or at least diminution of all else is a major problem. How big of a problem is that right now in terms of trying to attract European support for whatever comes next? I mean, John's characterization of this moment is one that could appear to Europeans as probably of intense confusion in what we're going to do, if anything, politically in that country.
Well, from the European point of view, American foreign policy making or decision making in Washington sometimes looks like tribal warfare on the bridge of an aircraft carrier. And the aircraft carrier is bearing down on us. So yes, it is a little difficult to understand. But going back to what John said, I think the problem is very much the lack of a political strategy, but it is also the lack of a military strategy. Events in Fallujah and Najaf in April showed us that the American military doesn't know what it's doing. It's not just that it doesn't know whom to talk to. It's been putting in one Iraqi general, pulling him out again, pulling in another general. It's been using different military tactics and techniques. None of that will convince a European general who otherwise would be quite happy to follow orders were he told by politicians to do this or that. But there's got to be some people in European defense ministries who are looking at all this on TV and are very, very worried indeed. But of course, the essential point to make here is I think that most Europeans can make a distinction and are willing to make a distinction between the debate about why it was right or wrong to go to war and what to do now. And I think there are many Europeans who are willing to say, we may disagree with you on what you did, but this is now all of our problem and we should be getting involved. However, we would also like you then to propose ways in which we can be involved to make this a success. And right now, we don't see you even trying to do this.
That's well said. That raises the next question, and I'll give Sam the first cut at it, but I'd love to hear everyone talk about this. How do we do that? I mean, how important is, and I think it is important, that we have transatlantic unity in whatever comes next, that is to say the forward phase, the transitional phase, the exit strategy, or whatever makes this a success. How does this country begin to attract European support?
It's very difficult, particularly in light of reports such as we're seeing today in the English language papers that the Spanish general in charge of the forces around Fallujah disagreed with the strategy of going into Fallujah and of taking al-Sadr's deputy captive and of closing the newspaper, and refused to carry out orders to do some of that and was overruled by the American military. So when European politicians and generals hear that and get more details, I'm sure they will follow. It doesn't look like the Americans are particularly good partners. So, I mean, we have to change what's hardest, a lot of attitudes,
Right.
not just strategies and tactics.
You're talking about attitudes in Washington?
Attitudes in Washington, attitudes among our own military there, many of whom believe that there can be a military solution. I mean, that's what military people get taught in their schools and
Right.
training courses. So they're doing that, and there have to be politicians who direct them differently and get them to think differently, because they're not in shock and awe mode right now. They need to really be winning friends, making accommodations, and figuring out those Iraqis whom they can work with.
I mean, the thing that I'd add, and I think it is political, is Fallujah and Najaf are great examples. We get it right. We realize, it's like this came back to Washington, and we need some indigenous people who have credibility with the Iraqis both there, and we're not part of the most barbaric aspects of the regime. So they find this general. They don't vet him. He goes
that's
in.
right.
The only reason they find out politically it's a problem is the Shia send a message through Sistani to Bremer. What are you doing? This guy is up to his ears in blood. You don't want him in there. And so then they haven't gotten that message, immediately shuttle in another general who has been better, but it's all panic stations. Even when they read the right message, they don't consult anybody. They don't go through the vetting process. It's all too fast now to make up for the problems. It's as though they're playing for time and they realize time isn't on their side, so they're making more and more mistakes as one does. I think the other point, though, to say from an American point of view is that there have been Americans stressing NATO's role in Iraq for a while now. And I do agree with Constanza. Many Europeans, I'd say particularly in Germany, are willing to have that discussion and talk about how that's done. I think in France, though, you don't find that. Dominique Moisy would be an exception. He's talked to me about that for a year and a bit now. But the majority of people there in power aren't willing to do it. They're still indulging in schadenfreude. and one of the problems with indulging in that is you don't get a say at the table if the French live in splendid isolation and realize that, frankly, the French have less influence in Washington than my intern does.
Let me just say, for all of those who, like myself, just learned Schadenfreude, it's delight in another's misfortune, I believe.
It is delight in another's misfortune.
I would like to jump in here. John, I'm not so sure about the French. I actually think that the French are more realist-minded than the Germans are in many things. They're less inclined to take the moral high ground, and while they may indulge in Schadenfreude, I think if they thought there was going to be a realistic prospect of a power-sharing and burden-sharing arrangement that would work, that they would be in there. In fact, there were leaks coming out of Paris in the last year or so that the French were actually thinking about joining a post-war stabilization force, remember? But let me ask you something else. One thing that I just still am failing to understand, and I'm hoping one of the Americans can help me, is that after all, we Europeans and Americans have been doing peacekeeping together, robust peacekeeping in the Balkans for the last 10 years now. Much of this involving the sort of heavy and often quite dangerous policing work that is now necessary in Iraq. Were there no lessons learned from this in the American military establishment? Why was this not brought over into Iraq?
I mean, I think, first of all, I'd say I think the French MOD are the most realist people in Europe and are a joy to work with. The problem is that the Quai d'Orsay tend to overrule them bureaucratically. The Quai are every bit as dogma-driven as any group in the Western world.
The diplomats overruling the military.
The diplomats overruling the military, the people with the Gaullist conception of a united Europe, and there's no sign of that at all, to put it kindly, in the aftermath of Iraq. So I think the problem is trying to liberate some of our allies in places like this to have them have a greater say without that backfiring, and these guys at the moment haven't done that. But I think Constanza's point about peacekeeping is a great one, and all I can say, and this is just my opinion, is that they really didn't think there would be a problem for this. They didn't think they'd need to worry about that because they believed that the Iraqis who had suffered so much under Saddam would somehow intrinsically then be pro-American. What would say, we hate Saddam, thus we love you. That it would be, as I was told, just like liberating Italy. And anybody who says that Italy in 1943 is Iraq in 2000, whatever we are, without looking at history, culture, sociology, anthropology, is missing the point. And I think since then they really didn't learn the lesson because they didn't think the lesson would have to apply. I mean, that's all I can think.
Well, Constanza and gentlemen, I know we could easily spend this program and a sequence of them on this Iraq issue, and probably should at some point. It would be a service. But to move away, well, not really, and to make almost a transition, if I might, from the Iraq situation to the continent of Europe and what it's undergoing right now in terms of its union, let me toss a name in here that just a few weeks ago I might not have used for this kind of question, and the name of the country is Spain, which, as everyone knows, has undergone an extraordinary election with an unexpected result. And in this country, it's viewed, I think it's fair to say, as primarily a reaction to the intractability of the Iraq situation and the terrorism incident in Madrid. And that is enough to produce shockwaves between Madrid and Washington. But there are also shockwaves in the Spanish election that affect the European continent and European Union, and I think there are. So I guess that's the question. I'd like to hear you all comment on it. Sam, if you want to start.
Well, the Aznar government, which had been in power and was expected to eke out a narrow re-election victory, had aligned itself very closely with the United States and with the Bush administration and with Tony Blair. And this alignment continued in the interaction within European Union politics. So that when Aznar and his colleagues in the cabinet misplayed their immediate reaction to the March 11th train bombings by immediately saying, in contravention of the evidence they had, that this was the Ba'ath terrorist group, ETA, and not some Muslim-inspired group. It backfired on them. They lost, and as a result, the incoming government with the new Prime Minister Zapatero finds itself surprisingly or surprised to be in power and having to generate a series of relationships and responses very quickly. Now, what they've done is to immediately pay calls in Paris and Berlin and reestablish their more traditional alignment on the continent, leaving Blair hanging off in splendid isolation, or not so splendid isolation, in fact, and the U.S. Quite estranged. So it's a big change in intra-European politics as well as in transatlantic politics.
So they've effectively played the Spanish card, so to speak,
Absolutely.
in terms of Berlin and Paris. To what effect, John and Constanza?
I mean, I think that's exactly right. And those of us in America looking at this happening, beyond the obvious thing that whatever we think, Al-Qaeda is sitting around their boardroom, and it's become a grant-making organization, very different than it started with. Groups come to it now and say, you inspire us, we need logistics, we need help, as they did in Bali, Ankara, Riyadh. We have this plan for Spain, and would you go in? And they did. They can now say, we had an impact, to put it mildly, in a major Western election. That certainly will encourage people in Al-Qaeda. I'm not saying that's due to the Spanish at all. I'm saying that's due to the mindset of the people in Al-Qaeda, and that's obviously bad news for all of us. What it does, though, in America is get rid of an alternative theory that was going on, which is that Italy, even though precarious, very much against the war among its public opinion, had been pro-American because of Berlusconi. Aznar was actually in better shape than Berlusconi. You throw in Blair, you throw in the Polish and the Central and Easterns, and you can say over time we can begin to change the nature of the Union, that it will become more Atlanticist, that even with the problems we've had, if we put our eggs in these baskets and are subtle about it over time, we can make the Union a better partner. When Spain then takes its calls, Sam rightly says, immediately with Germany and France, that kind of philosophy, which one heard a lot of in both the Democratic and Republican Party, is certainly being rethought at the moment. And I don't think we're yet to a place where we have any alternative view.
Right.
But that rather hopeful view about liberalization, about NATO first kind of view, where ESDP fits, which I certainly favor, fits into that process, that security blanket view I think is gone now.
Constanza.
Well, let me try and put a couple of different twists on that. One, I thought it was terribly unfortunate for conservative commentators like David Brooks and Edward Lutwak, who really didn't know Spain or Spanish politics, to accuse the Spanish of appeasement. What this was about was that the Spanish were fed up with their own government for lying to them and punished them for that, and being impetuous voters, that's what they did. And of course the Spanish have been living with terrorism very courageously for the last 40, 50 years. Secondly, I found it very unfortunate that Zapatero actually sort of went one step further than his election promise. In his election promise, he said, I will wait for a UN draft resolution, and then I will decide. He didn't even wait for the UN draft resolution, and the result of that was making it look as though, indeed, he was reacting to Al-Qaeda. Now, I would have hoped that in Berlin or in Paris, people in charge there would have called him up and said, we would advise you to sit this one out, and we will stand at your beside you, shoulder to shoulder, to explain to your electorate and our electorates why this is right and why we must not give Al-Qaeda the impression of being able to divide us. Finally, I think there's a misimpression in Washington that I think is necessary to correct about where Europe is going on this. It is my impression as a European that both Paris and Berlin have reconsidered their extremist position of a year ago. Both of them have been trying to get together with Washington again. Berlin very much has tried to find back its old balancing role, has tried to draw the British in on the ongoing debate about Europe and European defense, all of which, to my mind, argues a return to reason.
So in this return to reason, at a time when we have a 25-member EU, can I take that one step further, that we, to put the hopeful lens on, could see a reestablishment, if you will, of the traditional relationship or movement toward it? That things could be.
I think Berlin and Paris have understood that a Franco-German Directoire is not going to be able to lead Europe. And absent a constitution, and that's, I think we're not going to have a constitution in Europe for quite a while, not just because the British are going to have a referendum. Absent a constitution, what you need is a leadership group, probably, but one that is inclusive rather than exclusive. And it will not be able to work without the British, and it probably won't be able to work without the Poles.
And when you say inclusive, also taking into account the attitudes, if you will, of the 10 new members, which are, I suppose, strongly pro-American.
I don't think that's a cliche as well. That's a conventional wisdom which I think needs to be examined. I think the view in the new members is very much a case-by-case one. It's one thing on Iraq, another thing on visa, for example. They have been, some of them, very disappointed by American policies, both within NATO and others, the visa being an example. The Poles were terribly disappointed that the visa restrictions applying to them were not lifted. And I think the safest thing to say at this point is that the new members will try to play Europe and America out against each other within NATO and Europe, and frankly, that's their right, and more power to them.
Sure would.
Constanza, I like the answer. I also like the use of the phrase conventional wisdom and the mention of NATO, which brings us to the next thing I want to discuss, and to turn to John Holzman, who's a rough critic of conventional wisdom, I would think. As a matter of fact, and on NATO, you charted the course of this 50-year masterful alliance. I think everyone could say that. And in particular, our U.S. image of it, which has gone, I believe, through phases of romanticism to rejection, but to now what you hope to be a new realism.
Yep.
And what would that be in light of all that we're talking about here?
Well, I think the first generation of people at NATO were romantic about it because of the horrors of the beginning of the century, and I understand why. This is our last best chance, and Americans felt that way. People like Truman, who'd been in the First War, people like Adenauer, who'd gone through what he'd gone through, Schuman, Bevin, they all said very similar, this is it, and that we're going to make it work come what may. And that was a very helpful romanticism. And then, to use Gunnar Grass's kind of position, then the children of their fathers turn on them, and at the time of Vietnam say it's just another tool of American imperialism. And even that generation of leadership, if you even people like Blair, who is now very pro-NATO, but it's not the same heartfelt notion. Clinton, Schroeder come out of this tradition that they have a skepticism. Solana, ironically, made his name who was Secretary General of NATO and made his name as a leader in protests against Spanish involvement in NATO. And they kind of romantically rebel against their fathers. I think we're to a third generation where we say, as we were talking about, kind of Keith Richards' view of Mick Jagger, it's bigger than the both of us, darling, and we're going to have to stick together because we simply don't have anywhere else we're going to get allies. The Europeans will not find another superpower in the world that, if they can motivate, will do things that are useful for their point of view, and where else is America going to get genuine allies if we don't look at Europe? And Europeans have a right to say no, and American doesn't get to be Chicken Little and say the sky's falling in when someone says no to us, just as Europeans need to understand that if we don't get every single European country to agree with us on matters of strategy, that doesn't mean necessarily we're going to take our ball and go home
with it.
And as Sam said, the key is attitudinal. We're at this place where we've got to get our psychology on both sides. Accepting America has to listen more, has to be ready to see power, has to say, you're right here, we were wrong, and really take on board genuinely people's concerns in a way that the administration up to now has not been very good at, just as some Europeans, and I think of Belgium's trying to stop Turkey being defended, the idea that this is going to be taken seriously isn't really going to be real in this world.
Well, your realism is kind of reality all around, everyone sort of stepping up to the plate, so to speak, and being realistic about things, and what you've also called the clubhouse. And is that pretty much what the way you see it, Sam, that it still serves that purpose?
Very much so, and we come at this from somewhat different starting points, but right now we're at the same place. Mm-hmm.
Well, let me add another European twist to that. I think the problem really was that post 9/11, in fact, with actually going back to the beginning of this administration, and some very dismissive remarks about NATO in the national security strategy, this administration has treated NATO much in the way that in olden days the Soviet Union used the Warsaw Pact as a framework to manage its bilateral military relationships with people that it didn't really consider as allies who should be given a veto, or as equals, but more something like vassals. I know that this is I'm saying this to be outrageous, but there is a truth to that, and I think the Americans are coming back to realize that while coalitions of the willing may work to fight wars, they are terrible for trying to keep the peace or even find the peace, and that what NATO and in fact the UN have to offer is tried and established working by bureaucracies and militaries that are used to operating together, that are used to solving certain problems, and that have a lot of experience in doing this.
Oh, okay, well, let me toss this in before you even answer. Our time is so brief, I'm so much on this one. If all of this holds true, the clubhouse and everyone gets realistic and that wonderful past history, the peacekeeping and so forth, Is there going to be a role for NATO in the Iraq situation we discussed at the start? Is that going to happen? Could that happen?
I mean, I think in the meetings that come ahead, and I would say I think the clubhouse thing was utterly neglected. And in fact, NATO has always been more political than anybody's let on. It's actually the best part about NATO is that when we disagree, we can calibrate differences and keep them from coming off the table, as Iraq did, I might add. Partly that NATO wasn't used. You can argue this is part of why we are where we are. And secondly, you do pick up more people along if you listen to them, if you go through that process and have the time to do that. And that's something America should think about. You might get 2/3 of the allies instead of half. That's well worth the time and the effort. I mean, kind of to do. And I think that absolutely.
You know, what you're
critical.
both saying to me is we should add the diplomatic card to the military card with greater rigor in whatever games we're playing. Sam, do you agree with that?
I agree with it, but I don't think it's going to have near-term success, and the near term is where the problems are.
The next 30
So, I
days.
mean, it's all too much like a recent comment that I heard at one of the endless meetings that we circulate through, picking up and taking your initial question, can this marriage be saved, a step further. The comment was that ordinarily we would say this is a marriage that has come to the point where it needs counseling. We've already tried that. We've come to the point where you might try dating others, but there's no one else to date.
Certainly not the Russians.
That's sort of where we are, and we need to sit down and have a long discussion, just as John was saying, and I think see where we can come out.
But not only was that a masterful answer, you also preempted, so this is my key question at the end. So let me ask both of you, as we conclude this program, we have only a moment left, but can the marriage be saved? Sam has given us his view on it.
And I agree with Sam, it has to be saved. I mean, I think that the good news is that there are plenty of people who don't have any innate love, but have rediscovered NATO through bungling things up to now, and that the reality is on both sides, there simply aren't alternatives. And there are a lot of that hard-headed, pragmatic view, I think, may see us through, but there's going to be a bumpy ride ahead. I agree with Sam.
And you, Constanza?
I think we are very simply each other's best hope. And we need to realize that, and on that basis we've already done a lot and we can still do a lot, but the time to do it is now.
The time is now. This is the time indeed. Well, I think we can all agree on that. And I want to thank you all. I think you have certainly enlightened me, and I think all viewing, on some very important questions we should all be following. So, Constanza, Sam, John, thank you so much for being with me on Dialogue today.
Thank you.
Thoroughly enjoyed it. And that's our program. We welcome the comments of our viewers, and you can contact us at dialogue@wwic.si.edu. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching.